We're going to talk about how to frame what I call a good statistical question, which is the actual question that will be answered by the time you are done conducting your study. Built into this question are a lot of the elements of your study. Basically, by the time you're done framing your question, you've almost written the methods section of your study just there in one sentence. A lot of key elements need to be built into this. What is the population you are studying? Is this a study of all people nationwide? Is it a study of California residents, high school students at Terra Linda, fans of Insane Clown Posse, Juggalos? What is the group you're studying? What are the specific variables you're comparing? We've talked a lot about input and output variables. What are they? That should be built into the question. For example, if you're studying, your input variable is whether or not the students slept in the morning, and your output variable is their score on a math test. That should be built into the question you're asking. What is the specific method of measuring those variables? Is it an experiment? Is it an observational study? Is it a survey? How is the survey conducted? All that's built into your question. And then what is the relationship you are looking for? Are you looking for a correlation? Are you looking to see if there's any effect at all? What specifically is it you're looking for? Some things you want to try to avoid. Avoid vague terms. Don't say something like, who is smarter? What does that mean? What does smarter mean in the context of this study? Don't say, which is better? What does that mean? I don't know what better means for your study. You might instead say something like, who will have a higher score on a standardized IQ test? Well, that's a lot clearer than smarter. That's measurable. And don't imply that there will be causation unless you're going to be able to prove it. If I just say, does watching the Great British Baking Show make people less likely to go gluten-free? Well, my study may not show that. My study may show that people who watch the Great British Baking Show are less likely to avoid gluten, but that doesn't mean the show made them less likely. It could simply be that people who don't eat gluten are more likely to watch the show in the first place. So I might reframe my question to make it clear that I'm not expecting there to be causality. I might just say something like, who is more likely to choose a gluten-free diet, those who watch the show or those who don't? There's no implication here that the show makes them choose a gluten-free diet. It's just a question of which group of people has made the choice. Or I could frame it where it's obvious that I'm doing an experiment. Will watching a season of the Great British Baking Show decrease people's likelihood to choose a gluten-free diet compared to a control group? Now it's clear I'm doing an experiment. I'm actually going to expose half the people to the Great British Baking Show and the other half to a different competitive cooking show, and then I'm going to look at their effects. So there I would be able to infer causality because I've randomly assigned the people to the two groups. We'll talk more about that in a couple more lectures. So if you're supposed to avoid that language, what can you say? If you're looking at just a single categorical variable, what percent of people watch the Great British Baking Show? What fraction of people are fans of Justin Bieber? How many people are actually respecting the shelter-in-place orders? How likely are people to make a basket when they shoot a basketball? If it's a numerical variable, what is the average score on the test? What is the distribution of COVID-19 cases across the United States? If you're looking at two categorical variables, we've done a lot of this. This is like our project 1. Which group has a higher percentage of people who answered yes to the question? This project 2. People who were in treatment group 1 or people who were in the control group? Are men or women more likely to answer yes to a question? This is project 2, Project 1 would be comparing a categorical and a numerical variable. Who has a higher average test score? Who has a higher average height? People who played miniature golf or people who played pool? Who scored higher on this test, men or women, adults or teenagers? And then project 3, which you're kind of working on the back burner right now, is where we have two numerical variables. Is there any correlation between age and weight? What is the relationship between test score and number of Skittles eaten before taking the test? So here are some examples of some not good statistical questions. These are some examples of some questions that would be very challenging to answer with a good study, and we're going to reframe them. Take a second, pause the video here, take a second to give your own reframing of each of those. I'll come back to you in a few seconds. Pause the video and then restart. If you did not pause the video, you're breaking the rules. You're a rule breaker now. Let's look at some answers to those examples. Seems like people with giant luxury SUVs park in compact spots a lot. Is that true? Well, why don't we reframe it as what percentage of people driving full-size luxury SUVs park in compact parking spots? Notice the sentence framing from one categorical variable. Does garlic lower cholesterol? Well, we might say who has lower cholesterol? People who take garlic or a control group taking a placebo. There's our two categorical variables. Excuse me, there is our one categorical and one numerical, because lower cholesterol is numerical. Do high school students believe the same thing about politics as their parents? Well, how are we going to measure believing same things about politics? I might have some spectrum from very liberal to very conservative, 0 to 10, or negative 10 to positive 10, or some spectrum like that. I might have some standardized test that I give people to put them on that spectrum. Then I've got two numerical variables, the one for the high school students, the one for the parents, and I might look to see if there's a correlation or a relationship between those two. Okay, so now that I've got my question framed, how do I answer it? As discussed in the appendix, there are three major ways to do that. We could do a sample survey, which we've done before in project number 1. We're going to give a survey to a representative sample of a population. We have not talked about a representative sample yet, but we'll get to that shortly. This is pretty cheap. We can survey a couple hundred people and make inferences about the entire population of Terralinda High School students, for examples. But if we're not careful about it, it's really, really, really easy to introduce a lot of error. And when we're done, the results do not determine causation for us. We can conduct an observational study where we're just going to go out and observe people in the wild, maybe by asking them questions or just seeing what they do. This is pretty cheap. It's also very real. We've made no manipulations. We're just seeing what's happening. We get to see what's happening in the real world. But because we can't manipulate the variables, at the end, we cannot determine causation. What that means is we cannot say at the end of a survey or an observational study that one variable has caused the other. All we can say is that they're related or not related, but we have no way of saying that one causes the other. The only way to be able to say that one variable actually causes changes in the other is to do an experiment where we manually manipulate one of the variables so we can observe the impact on the other variable. The reason why we don't always just do an experiment, it's difficult, it's expensive, sometimes it raises significant ethical issues. Sometimes the results we get don't generalize outside of the laboratory. They're very artificial. And sometimes it's just frankly impossible. Moving on. So which would you pick for each of these three? For example, if I was doing does garlic lower cholesterol, I'm looking for causation. I have to run an experiment. I cannot do any sort of an observational study or a sample survey because that won't tell me whether garlic has resulted in lower cholesterol. It might just tell me whether people who have low cholesterol happen to also take garlic supplements. That isn't what I'm asking. I want to know if garlic causes the change. I have to randomly assign people to one group or the other. Take a look at these three questions again. Pause it and come back to it in just a minute. Did you pause it? I don't think you paused it. Pause it now. All right. Hopefully you've answered the questions. Let's look at my answers here. I want to know whether people with SUVs park in a compact spot more or less than other similarly sized non-luxury cars. That's going to be an observational study. I want to actually go out in the real world and see what they do. I don't want to ask a survey because then people might lie to me and not give me an honest answer. I don't know how I'd conduct an experiment, give people different sized cars and then see where they park. But that also takes away a variable that matters to me, which is, are the sort of people who buy luxury SUVs also the same sort of jerks who park in spots that are way too small for them? If I'm looking at the correlation of views from high school students to their parents, I'm going to do a survey. I'm going to ask people what their views are and correlate those and find the relationship. I can't do an experiment. I'm not going to randomly assign high school students to different parents and see what their view happens. That would be impossible and grossly unethical. If I want to see whether people prefer Coke or Pepsi, I want to do an experiment. I could do a survey or an observational study, But that would actually tell me what people think they prefer. Whereas with an experiment, I could see what they actually prefer by putting the two drinks in identical cups and seeing which one they like the taste of more. So this would actually give me a more interesting answer than just what people think they prefer. Thank you much.